All right, so I want to first note that this is a Birdsell Dries and Lamoureux lecture. It's sponsored by the GSA Hydrogeology Division. John Birdsell was a hydrologist for the USGS. Shirley Dries was a Birdsell lecturer, but tragically her life was cut short during her prime. So it became the Birdsell Dries lecture. And not too long ago, the Lamoureux family donated some extra funds so the lecturer can actually travel more internationally. When I'm in the US, I'm the Birdsell Dries lecturer. When I'm overseas, I'm the Lamoureux lecturer. And as Danny said, and actually on top of this support, I want to thank Danny and Dean Mora. They doubled up the support. So now I can actually visit about a dozen countries and give 72 talks over the course of a year. And it's the first time in my life since I was in grad school in 1999, I'm not teaching in a classroom within a calendar year. So yeah, I get to take a break, but I get to lecture in many other places. I want to point out that this talk I'm presenting on other topics, is definitely a team effort, and as are most of the other talks I'm presenting. In particular, I want to note my colleagues in the Philippines who really make all this work possible, students at UT and colleagues here, and awesome people at other universities as well. So this is hot off the press, yet another depiction of the global water cycle, and I think Bridget is on this paper. Okay. No? Okay, but they're trying to basically put bounds on the global water cycle. One thing that's important here is we have river runoff that goes from land to ocean. We kind of know that, we can measure that. And here they actually have estimates for groundwater coming from land to sea. Okay, and it's shown here as about 1/10 of river runoff, which is too high. I think this is a wrong number. It's probably more like 1% of river runoff. So we call this phenomenon submarine groundwater discharge. We know rivers go to the sea, but if there's one thing I want you to understand, groundwater always flows to the ocean too. And we call this SGD, okay? Submarine groundwater discharge. Another complicating factor here is what if, those mountains, and many mountains, are actually volcanoes, right? And in these coastal areas too, particularly in the tropics, we have teeming coral reefs, teeming with life. Very important. And I might add, even though there is a number here, that's pretty much a black box, particularly in many places. You can go to anywhere right now, say Texas, we know how much water is coming out of our rivers. How much groundwater is coming out of Texas to the coast? All bets are off, right? So it's still a black box. And others have shown too that despite SGD being a low number in terms of fluids, it's very important for things like nitrogen. And in this review paper, these colleagues show that the amount of nitrogen going to the ocean through groundwater is actually higher than that of rivers. So that means SGD can have important roles or impacts, including coral calcification, productivity, fisheries, denitrification, and pollutant attenuation. Of course, it can lead to problems if the groundwater is polluted, right? If the groundwater is polluted, it's coming out to your ocean, you've got eutrophication, blooms, deoxygenation, ocean acidification. Another important thing that happened in 2020, aside from the pandemic, is this thing very important for groundwater hydrologists. The Supreme Court rendered a decision that actually recognized submarine groundwater discharge, believe it or not. So this is that decision, where in this, if you zoom in here, which is this text, it's about the Clean Water Act, which says that any addition of any pollutant from any point source to a navigable water body without appropriate permit from the EPA is basically illegal, right? You need permits to dump stuff, especially if it's dirty water. But it has to be a point source. It's hard to figure out if somebody's putting stuff in groundwater and then it goes somewhere else. Well, this is what happened in Hawaii, where they basically said a wastewater treatment plant is breaking the law under the Clean Water Act. But what they were doing is, so this is the island of Maui. This is their wastewater treatment plant, and since they can't dump water into the ocean because they would violate the Clean Water Act, they pump it into the ground. But, of course, now we know there's SGD. And in Hawaii, these are permeable basalts. And that water that they've been pumping in comes out into the ocean. We're going to look at a couple of springs here. So this is what happened, right? Basically, nitrogen-rich groundwater is coming out and it's killed the reef. And they were found liable for that. I don't know what changes they've done since then. So that's a specific problem. This is a kind of recent study that tried to quantify SGD from land to ocean around the world. And I know the authors here, aside from the postdoc who's the lead author, everybody here was at the University of Texas at some point. So pretty cool. But you can see blue is high, yellow, orange is low. And you can see where the high areas are. They're mostly in the tropics. In fact, if you zoom into one high area, you can see here, that's actually the coral triangle. And the coral triangle, it's called the Amazon of the sea. It's really the most biodiverse marine region in the world. And I'm fortunate to have I'm from the apex of the coral triangle, which is the Philippines. And I want you to note this too, this place called Raja Ampat. We'll get back to that later. So this is biological study that where they did is basically they looked at papers synthesized and quantified fish biodiversity throughout Coral Triangle, Southeast Asia, and you can see where the hotspots are, red being the highest. So the central part of the Philippines is a biodiversity hotspot, and if you just look at the biodiversity of endemic species, it's even a smaller hotspot, right there, it's still in the Philippines. Question really is, so in these places, what are the SGD fluxes? What is the physical and chemical nature of this SGD? And does this SGD have an impact on coral reef ecosystems? We're going to zoom into this hotspot, which is this red box. In the middle of this is this, they call this the Verde Island Passage, because in the middle is Verde Island. So this is the Verde Island Passage Marine Corridor. Again, this is the world's hotspot of marine biodiversity according to that paper. And we're the study site is in the middle of that. So we call it the center of the center of the center of marine biodiversity. This is that star. What's also unique there is there's a lot of volcanoes. The Philippines is an island arc. It's got subduction zones left and right. And this is Mount Pinatubo here. I actually grew up around there. We're going to zoom in at this caldera system. Actually, it's quite complicated, quite big, which is Taal volcano. This is right before the world changed, but it decided to change prior to the other upheaval. It erupted. And you can see how it changed the environment. But we're going to zoom back in time and look at Taal before the eruption. So this is our team looking at the main crater lake. This is the view of that main crater lake. This is that same view in thermal infrared. Of course, it's an active volcano, so you can see the soil is hot. There's some warm areas, but interestingly, there's some warm areas along the lake, in the water, along the shore. So we're going to zoom in there where the arrow is. And this is what you kind of see. If you're there, just hanging out with your friends, having a beer, it looks like a nice, beautiful lake. But you look at it in thermal infrared, and all of a sudden you notice, oh my gosh, there's actually springs everywhere along the shore, and it's hot water gushing out. So we set out to figure out why is this happening? What's the hydraulics of this process? So we set up a study transect. You can see this is that much sticking out. So we drive in these piezometers or groundwater wells. We'll look at one part here where we're able to do a 2D cross section and we measure temperature. You can see the temperature here going from close to 80 degrees right here and about 50 right here. And if you know something about thermal gradients, it's supposed to get hotter as you get deeper, not as you go sideways, right? And there's a reason for that, and we set out to explain that. What I was looking for is there a water table inclined towards the lake that's pushing this water? But this is what we end up seeing. So I tried to explain this by setting up something we do a lot in my lab, groundwater flow model. In this case, it's a more complicated one because you have to add heat transport, and some of the water, they have different salinities. You have to consider that. It's complex, basically. But you also have to at these high heat fluxes and temperatures. But basically, I had fun on my computer trying to figure things out, and this is the result. Color is temperature. The lines that you see are flow lines. What you end up producing on a computer is these convection cells, which I'm not so sure if they exist, but what's interesting here is look at the temperature pattern. It is pretty much spot on to our observations. And you get that temperature pattern because of convection too. You have lake water coming in, it gets heated up, spits out right there where we see those springs. And this is a picture here exactly right where the transect is. But this is pretty much the same kinematics and dynamics as submarine black smokers. This is what happens near mid-oceanic ridges. So keep that in mind because we're going to look at other springs along the coast. So we're going to go to the coast now, this area here. This is a picture of our study site. It's called Twin Rocks. It's a marine protected area, and this resort where we stay is called Planet Dive. If you can see those two things there, the white specks, those are the Twin Rocks, if you have good enough vision. We're going to zoom out first and figure out how special the place is. This is a more updated study looking at biodiversity hotspots in Southeast Asia, now using multiple layers of data and GIS, and they identified 7 hotspots, 3 in the Philippines, 4 in Indonesia. One of them is called Raja Ampat. It's been called the heart of the coral triangle. This is the stuff that National Geographic shows. They have documentaries on it. It's a special place. It's called the heart of the coral triangle. We're going to compare Raja Ampat to our site here, which is again Twin Rocks. So this is Twin Rocks. This is Raja Ampat. Coral cover is about the same, and these are not my studies from other papers. Look at the fish. There's a lot more fish at Twin Rocks. That's kilograms per hectare. And this is a fish count of fish of a given size. So Raja Ampat, sure, it's special, but it looks like even, my backyard in the Philippines, Twin Rocks, is even more special. And the Great Barrier Reef, really, it's big, but it's big. That's it. That's all I can say. So this is Twin Rocks, a 360 view. These are Twin Rocks. So it's a typical cosmopolitan coral reef. Different corals, lots of fish, the visibility is but if you look at these corals and all the fish, it's very different. By all means, but lots of things. But this is a better view. This is taken by a professional photographer. I mean, this is just one of the rocks, and you can just see it's just beautiful and full of life. Every square inch is covered in coral. Okay, so those are the Twin Rocks, and I took the video right about here. What's also interesting about Twin Rocks is you look at it in thermal infrared, and you see seeps. These are hot seeps in thermal infrared coming out right in front of Twin Rocks, right in front of the marine protected area. So we dug some holes on the ground to sample groundwater. These 5 holes here, these are the samples, to learn more about what this groundwater is like. Some important things: salinity, ocean is 35. So some are close to seawater, some are fresh. They're warm, they're warmer than seawater, and the warmer they are, the fresher they tend to get. This one is a big one. So that's the partial pressure of CO2 or dissolved CO2, microatmospheres or ppm. The ocean is close to 400 because it's in equilibrium with the atmosphere. So these are high, and this is in groundwater that's potentially coming out to Twin Rocks. These are astronomically high. This is another important thing. This is radon. So this is a gas we measure in the groundwater. Radon is pretty much close to 0 in the ocean, and it's very high in this groundwater. The importance of that is we can now measure radon in the ocean, and if we're picking it up in the ocean, it tells us there is SGD, right? So it's a tracer for SGD. We measure the chemistry of the groundwater, nitrate, phosphate, ammonium. pH is low, so it's acidic. Seawater is about 8.1. This is a global concentration of reef water samples. You can see this is higher. So it's actually got high nutrients. I still don't know whether it's anthropogenic or natural. It's acidic, and it's very high CO2, and it's also high in radon. Kind of unique characteristics for groundwater seeping out. What we then set out to do is we tried to quantify SGD finally. We know what the groundwater is like. Let's see how much is coming out. So how this works is, this was, sorry, I have to go back. This was work done by Roger, a PhD student from Colombia originally, but he was doing his PhD in Australia. He set up camp there for like 2 weeks and just tended to these instruments where he was pumping groundwater from Twin Rocks into these two devices that measure radon and CO2 every 15 minutes. And he was there for really like just 2 weeks, making sure nothing breaks. And that's powerful because what we can do is, if we know all other sources of radon, and we're left with just one unknown, particularly radon from groundwater, you can actually calculate the submarine groundwater discharge flux. It's just simple mass balance, but you have to know or measure the other terms, which we do or we kind of constrain. So this is our time series data. It's the ocean, so it's got tides going from neap to spring tide. These are day-night cycles. This is the radon. Radon in blue in units of disintegrations per minute per cubic meter. And let's look at what happens, say, at this high tide. High tide, the radon drops to 0 because it's the seawater encroaching, which has 0 radon. That's the background. You go to low tide, radon shoots up because during low tide, what's happening? The groundwater is pushing out of the beach when the sea is low. So radon shoots up because you have SGD. And from our mass balance, you can convert that to fluid flux, centimeters per day, just like you can think of it, you know, it rained 0.1 inches per day today. So it's centimeters of water per day. It's the SGD, and you can see here how it shoots up during these low tides. We also measured CO2 and O2, so something that's important here. You guys are part of the carbon cycle, right? How many of you guys are producing CO2 right now? Good. Right, so you're all respiring, taking in O2, producing CO2. So we can see this cycle here, day-night cycle. When O2 drops, CO2 is produced. And you see the opposite, when you have photosynthesis, uses up oxygen and, produces oxygen, CO2 drops. So this is a biological rhythm. And you can see their mirror images. This is what the atmosphere should be. Atmospheric is 417 microatmospheres. But you can see here, during these peaks in CO2 or submarine groundwater discharge, you have a surplus of CO2. So pretty much is, you know, a smoking gun telling us, yes, this groundwater is delivering high CO2 to the reef. As you can see there. Because we know the CO2 concentration in the groundwater, we can convert this fluid flux to a CO2 flux. In this case, moles per area per square meter per day. And that's going to be useful, right? But let's compare first. I know I'm the only one here who likes SGD, well, except for all grad students maybe from my lab. But let's just compare. This is SGD at Twin Rocks at our site. 35 centimeters per day is the average. Peak is close to 300. These are other sites. This is supposedly the highest recorded so far. And you can see we're pretty close to that, and the peak is higher. So Twin Rocks has very high SGD. This isn't the Great Barrier Reef, so it's pretty high too. It's close to that. This is low, this is low. This is another site in the Philippines. So it's high at Twin Rocks, okay? The fluid flux of submarine groundwater discharge is high, and it's pretty clear to us it has volcanic influence. Now let's look at the carbon. Let's look at the CO2. I mentioned this is the CO2 flux. If you take the average, 266 millimoles per square meter per day, we calculated how much CO2 is degassing from the reef to the atmosphere. It's this much. So this is 100-fold higher. What this means is any carbon balance has been disturbed or dominated by groundwater. Let's look more at carbon. This is that flux that I mentioned. And other flux terms or sources and sinks of carbon are calcification, so when corals grow and calcify, produces CO2. Photosynthesis uses up CO2. Respiration produces CO2. And the difference between these two, we call it production or net production for the ecologist. So let's compare some numbers from other papers. This is calcification at the Great Barrier Reef, 73 to 160. Net production at the GBR from negative to slightly positive, but notice they're about the same magnitude. But really this one study here kind of put together all the different numbers for calcification production, pretty much. The SGD CO2 flux at Twin Rocks is higher than all these terms. So what that means is the SGD CO2 flux is one, it's much bigger than evasion, it's larger than production, and it's probably larger than calcification. What this means is that Reef is probably, in terms of its CO2 cycle or carbon cycle, is groundwater dependent or strongly coupled to groundwater. Next question. Is this CO2 regionally important? We looked at one site here. A Filipino student I supervise and a good friend of mine, Emoy Rodolfo, put the radon instrument and a CO2 measurement device on a boat and just went around the study site, which is a peninsula. And this is what he found. So let's look at radon first, this panel. Background seawater should be 2 to 5 becquerels per cubic meter. So the units of radon is radioactivity because it's radioactive. It should be 2 to 5. That means if you have anything higher than that, we have SGD, most likely. It's the main source of radon. And you can see here, 2, 4, 6, this is somewhat high, 9, 16, that's high, 24, this is where Twin Rocks is, 13. You look at this area, 23, that's high, 41, that's high. So there's some high areas. CO2, close to atmospheric or equilibrium 400s. Some are higher near Twin Rocks, 417. This is high, 438, 1,200, 500. So there's some hot spots. On the other side of the peninsula, Twin Rocks is right here. And what did we find in those areas? Well, we found places like this where CO2 is coming up. So we went ahead and sampled the gases and the water, as you'll see here. So Emoy drove in this steel pipe just to suck out some more water. We analyzed. And we did that over and over again over multiple years at multiple places. Some places you can just see water is out. There's no gas. So water is out. In these mounds, which are pretty cool. These mounds are like tiny volcano springs. You can see streaks of water coming out. And in some spots, it's hot water is actually so hot, sometimes it's 5%. And we discovered a few more things going deeper because a diver told us, hey, I think I found deeper springs at about 150 feet. So we decided to look for it. Look at that spot, and this is what we saw, and I apologize for the video because this is actually far. That's why it looks grainy. But the diver here, my buddy Gords, he's about that far away from me. But what he's pointing at here is you can see this depth. This big complex here. CO2 is coming out here. This is getting closer, but we're still about 20 feet away from that. So that's how big that is. And this is swimming through that area. You can actually see white spots with biofilm where the CO2 is at this point. This is the most dramatic one. It's kind of spread out, almost like the South. And what we did too is we brought sensors with us to measure stuff in situ. This is the same CO2 sensor, so we're able to measure CO2 at that spot. And it's everywhere during the dive. It's more than 1,000 microatmospheres or ppm, but near that jacuzzi-looking place, which I call Soda Springs, it reached 100,000 ppm, and it was beyond calibration of the instrument. So I don't know how reliable those numbers are. Okay, And we analyzed that gas. This is one of those samples. It's 90% CO2. And Dan Breaker analyzed the delta carbon-13, which is this 7.1 per mil. And he tells me that means it's probably magmatic, not of biogenic origin. Okay, so yeah, you've seen lots of springs now. How are those springs connected, right? How are they related or not? So this is Aya sampling some of those springs as part of her thesis. We did more sampling and analyzed those waters, right? So let's look at just some broad patterns. This is pH. This groundwater sample is an inland groundwater sample from wells like this, from residential wells. So pH is close to neutral. Seawater, this is actually high for seawater, maybe 8.3. These are the springs, coastal springs, the SGD springs, and you can see it's spread out, but they're all acidic. This is very acidic compared to the ocean, 5.5 to 6.5. Partial pressure of CO2, you've got groundwater and seawater here, SW is seawater. You can see the SGD waters are kind of spread out, but they're all high in the many thousands. Again, the atmosphere is 420 or so. Salinity, you can see here, inland groundwater is fresh. This is seawater, and the SGD is kind of overlapping with seawater, but closer to seawater than fresh groundwater. Well, one thing Aya did too is we analyzed stable isotopic composition of these waters. So this is the delta deuterium and delta O18. You can see the N members here. These are the groundwater samples. These are the seawater samples. This one is not our data, but from a previous publication, these are the hydrothermal waters from the volcano that erupted. Okay, which is about 15 kilometers away. These are our samples. So you can see our samples plot in this 3 end member mixing space. Some of the samples, A, B, and C, are these shallow springs, which nominally have equal portions of terrestrial groundwater and hydrothermal water, these two hues of red or brown. Some samples look like they have a lot of seawater. Blue is seawater, but they still have proportions of those other end members, groundwater and surface water. And believe it or not, those two dramatic springs that you saw, they're mostly hydrothermal water. I guess not believe it or not. But that's pretty interesting, right? It's a complicated mix. So really what you're looking at is something like this, which hydrogeologists could spend their career trying to figure out these flow paths. Okay? But these samples tell us that. There's complex mixing and pathways that these samples take. Wow, I'm going fast. Okay, so next question, again similar, is how regionally extensive is this volcanic thermal SGD? And this is work done by Ebony with the help of lots of other people, where, I'm actually going to go back. We do multiple techniques, all of which take advantage of the thermal signal of this SGD. It's hot. So anything that detects warm temperatures might be useful, which is pretty much what we did, where we use remote sensing, this new technique which I'll talk about, and the remote sensing is both drone-based and satellite-based. Okay, so it required a big team. Helping out Ebony were Chris Pratt, who used this device. I'll talk about that in a little bit. And Ryan owned the drones, and we put thermal infrared sensors on it. So what is this wire? That's a fiber optic cable. And it's actually steel wrapped so it doesn't break. But it's like 400 pounds. So it's not fun to work with it. And I literally had to ship it. Put it on a ship and cross my fingers that it'll make it there 2 months later. And it did, and it got out of customs. And my collaborator told me when I was going to return it, I told him I think it's a one-way trip. But he hasn't complained. It's about the device, the cable is probably, where's my pointer? I think this just died. It's about $500. But what's special about this fiber optic cable is if you run a laser through it and look at the properties of that laser as it comes back and travels to the cable, it gives you temperature. Pretty much every 30 to 50 centimeters along that cable. And the limits of this cable is your pocketbook and your muscles, right? You can have this go across the Pacific and you can get data, right? In our case, it's a kilometer-long cable. So what Ebony first did is just look at free data. So looking at satellite remote sensing, in this case from Landsat. So this is a thermal infrared image from Landsat. The issue with this is the pixels are 30 meters. Well, Twin Rocks is 30 meters across. It's 30 meters away from the beach. So there's a potential issue. So what Ebony did to check what's going on is she looked at 3 buffers, if you will, lines going out, 3 pixels, close to the shore and coming out, and at 3 different times when the sky was clear, and this is what you see. I don't know what that color is, lavender, I guess, which would be this purple here. That's the furthest out, but what you can see is even 100 meters out from shore, you can still see signals, anomalies in temperature, and this is going around the coast, about 30 kilometers. But that's really the point here. You can see all these spikes, bunch of anomalies of up to 2 degrees, 3 degrees, right? But again, you're far out to the sea here, and you're still seeing some sort of warming signal. This one is actually quite noisier because you're close to the coast, you're picking up some land pixels. And that's why we decided to move out gradually. So anyway, at this scale, it told us, there are some spots where it's kind of warm, so there must be some warm SGD potentially. Overlaid on top of this is a drone transect, so the drone flew along the peninsula, and then the DTS is actually quite short relative to this scale. So this is the drone transect. Our colleague Ryan flew the drone multiple times around the coast to get a mosaic of images so he can, or Ebony can stitch them up. And once you've stitched them up, you can now do a transect, in this case about 25 kilometer transect going from A to I. And here now you can detect even more discrete signals. And the resolution of this is about, I don't know, about a meter, 30 centimeters. So that's why we're picking up these more pronounced hotspots now. So yeah, lots of hotspots, potential SGD, but really if you zoom in, like this image, you really see the springs. So this is one spring here, hot water coming out. This is that delineated, and you can see it, just multiple examples of springs coming out. Both the satellite image and the drone image, it only measures the skin temperature. So this is the very surface of the water, right? It's really the upper, probably a couple of millimeters is what's it sensitive to. The question is, what's happening at the seabed? So that's what this fiber optic cable is allowing us to do. So you lay it along the seabed, which again, it was a lot of effort. We hired, I think, 7 park rangers to deal with this thing. I mean, think about it. This is more than a kilometer long, and there's waves, there's rocks, you're walking on coral. It's not fun. The only reason why it was possible is we had people helping us out. And you know, you go to places like the Philippines, labor is cheap. So it took us about an entire morning just to lay it out along this transect. And then I'm not sure if we did it the following day, probably this other transect. The color here is temperature from 1 to 5. And you can see there's a warm area here, which is this area, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. You can see these warm areas. And Twin Rocks is right about here. So it's actually warm there. This one I didn't know about, but there was also a spike there, which is not visible here. You go to the other side, where those dramatic springs are. You can already tell from the color, it's warmer. And this background dashed line here is background seawater. You can see it's just warmer on that side, period. And you can still see some discrete springs, but generally half a degree warmer. Now you have to realize, well, what's half a degree? It doesn't mean much, but you're in the ocean here. The ocean is always mixed. There's a big body of water, and we're still detecting these thermal anomalies. Because it's not on the bed, it's just kind of floating on the seabed. So that's pretty much it, and then I have a few more comments. But what we've learned is this volcanic SGD is prevalent around the coast of this peninsula, and possibly really in other parts of the Verde Island Passage. This SGD has diverse sources based on its geochemistry. It really implies complex flow processes and mixing. I would bet it's very important for the region's ecology and biogeochemistry. And I'm going to zoom back a little bit, but this is really the end part of my technical talk. So going back to this ridges to reefs idea, right? This is the cover slide, if you still remember it. It's actually from a very old book. This is the actual pictures of today, or whatever I can get on the web and Google Earth. But these are, this is one-to-one. But what this is an old volcano and it's got an atoll around it, which is classic, right? But this is an extinct volcano. The Philippines is different, and Southeast Asia is different because the volcanoes are active. So this is a map that we came up with not too long ago. Well, just downloading data really. These are Holocene volcanoes in red, corals in blue. So you can really see in the coral triangle, you know, the entire coral triangle is an island arc. So you do expect this association of active volcanism close to coral reefs. That's a given, but this is just visualizing that. And you can see the Great Barrier Reef here. You see all the reefs, but there's no volcanoes in Australia. Well, it turns out, going back to this image, in that same book, they already made the same map. And I saw this after we made that map. It's kind of coincidence. And in this map, they also use the same color scheme. Red for volcanoes, blue for reefs, right? And the title of this plot is some map showing the distribution of different kinds of coral reefs together with the position of active volcanoes. Pretty cool. And any guesses how old this map is? It's older than the University of Texas, I think. And the author is pretty famous too. So this was Darwin's first book, right? This was his first manuscript coming out of his first trip on the Beagle. But yeah, he was really doing geology and talked about the origin of coral reefs as they form from as they become atolls from extinct volcanoes. So he already had this idea, right? I can't claim this idea, unfortunately. 1842. His idea, of course, was different, right? He was looking at atolls. But this is text from the book, and of course, all of Darwin's books are free to download. But he mentioned the Philippines. He said, there's this volcano that's 60 miles. Does England still use miles? 60 miles from this reef, which is, this is Ambil Island, the closest I could find with the same name. And Apo Reef is right here. That's actually, I honeymooned there 25 years ago. Well, so it's actually close to our site. Pretty interesting. But Darwin did make a mistake. So this is actually Twin Rocks right here at low tide. This is that Ambil Island. If you look from our site this way, west, you can actually see it. It's not a volcano. It's actually an ophiolite. But it looks like a volcano, right? But we can't blame that. It was 1842, but he was right? He already had an idea of there must be this connection, but he was looking at spatial connection. And really, what we've tried to do is some of this connection must be through groundwater. Okay? So with that, thank you very much. I hope there's plenty of questions.